Expectant hush. We can't start until Mike comes in.
Welcome everybody, good afternoon. I'm Mike Sauter. I am Head of Humanities at the University of Suffolk. I'm also associated with the Center for Culture and Heritage at the University of Suffolk. And welcome to our latest May Days event, we'd like to call it. This one is celebrating 325 years of dissent, the Unitarian Meeting House in Ipswich. This event has been sponsored by the Center for Culture and Heritage, as I just mentioned, the Friends of the Unitarian Meeting House, the Suffolk Archives, and the Ipswich Society. So we have brought together very many institutions to celebrate a very old building in this lovely town. We have two speakers today. The way things will go, I will introduce each speaker sequentially. They will have time to make their presentation, and then we have decided to put all the questions to the end. So we're going to give everyone time to take their notes, come up with their issues, and then we will have, as best we can, a general discussion about all the things that have just been mentioned. So our first speaker is Minister Emeritus, Reverend Cliff Reed. Cliff sent me a very long biography, which I will now shorten. Apparently, Cliff was born in 1947 in London, and his commitment to Unitarianism began in his teens, and he became active in the Unitarian Young People's League, becoming the national president at the age of 20. He qualified as a librarian and went to Guyana with voluntary services overseas, and then once back in Britain, he worked at Dr. Williams' Library in London and became a member of the Golders Green Unitarian Church. Called to the ministry then, he trained at Unitarian College, Manchester, and studied theology at Manchester University. And in 1976, he began his ministry here in Ipswich, along with some other towns outside. And then I was particularly interested to see this in 1992. He took an exchange ministry in a place I didn't know existed in my country, Bloomington, Illinois. So I learned something. He's always been active in the wider Unitarian movement. He has served as Secretary of the International Council of Unitarians and Universalists and as President of the General Assembly of Unitarian and Free Churches. He then retired in 2012 and was appointed Minister Emeritus. And he also asks us to tell you that he still leads occasional services at the Unitarian Meeting House. So the title of his talk is We Are Now in the Tabernacle of Meeting, the Origins and Founders of the Ipswich Unitarian Meeting House. Close that. That's fine. Slideshow. And one final note, the various talks are being recorded, but rest assured no one will actually be filmed. And when the question and answer session comes around, we will simply not include any of the questions in the video. And as I was mentioning to Tessa, this is just to make certain that none of you is wanted by the police. Give you a chance to hunt you down. From the beginning. There you go.
All set? Well, thanks very much for the introduction. And it's good to see such a good turnout for this. Looking at the history of dissents in Ipswich, we actually have to go a little bit further back than 325 years to the, really, well, I'm starting at the end of the Commonwealth period, when, in fact, during that period, we'd seen the breakdown of the Church of England, the Episcopalian system, along with the Commonwealth period and the abolition of the monarchy. Now, during that Commonwealth period, the two dominant denominations were the Presbyterians and the Independents. And they're different. They differed from the national church and from each other on the question of church government. And the Congregationalists believing that each congregation was an independent church in its own right. The Presbyterians did believe in a national church, but one run on Presbyterian lines. And during the Commonwealth period, a number of the pulpits, the Anglican pulpits, were in fact taken over by Presbyterians and Independents. And that was the sort of the setting in which the dissenters emerged. Now, the restoration of the monarchy brought about the restoration of the Church of England, and a series of Acts of Parliament known as the Clarendon Code established a new order, one in which those denominations of Independents, the Presbyterians, found themselves on the wrong end of the law. So the Clarendon Code, named after the Lord Chancellor Edward Hyde, Earl of Clarendon, in 1661, the Corporation Act made the taking of Anglican communion a requirement for holding public office, and so excluding those who became known as dissenters or nonconformists. In 1662, the Act of Uniformity was passed, and this required all clergy to conform to the rites and ceremonies of the Book of Common Prayer, and to do so by August the 24th, 1662, St. Bartholomew's Day. This is a crucial date in our story, because on that day, which became known as Black Bartholomew, over 2,000 clergy who refused to conform were ejected from their livings, ejected from their pulpits and from other positions such as teachers, etc. In fact, only one of those people could be described as a Unitarian, so we're not really talking much about Unitarianism at this point. But the only one amongst them who could be described as a Unitarian was a Suffolk man named William Manning. So, the Great Ejection, as it came to be known, saw the enforced departure of about 1/5 of the total clergy from the Church of England, and also, of course, the departure of many lay people too, who followed their ministers. And these groups formed what were the first dissenting or nonconformist congregations. Such a congregation was probably formed in Ipswich in 1662, but their troubles were far from over. In 1664, the Conventicle Act outlawed meetings of more than 5 people from not of the same household for unauthorised worship. In 1665, the 5 Mile Act forbade dissenting or nonconformist ministers on pain of imprisonment from coming within 5 miles of incorporated towns like Ipswich or the place where they had formerly ministered. They were forbidden also to teach in schools, and theoretically this act remained in force until 1812. Under the pressure of this legislation, dissenting congregations had to meet and worship in secret, which is probably why there is no actual record of one in Ipswich until 1672. Then there was what was known as an indulgence was issued, which allowed the dissenters to meet and to call ministers. And the dissenting congregation in Ipswich, which at that time consisted both of Presbyterians and of independents or Congregationalists, that congregation called the Reverend Owen Stockton, one of the ejected clergy who had previously held a living in Colchester. From 1672, he ministered to dissenting congregations in Ipswich and in Colchester. And here in Ipswich, they met in the Greyfriars, or Old Monastery House, in Torwick Lane in St Nicholas Parish. Stockton was described at that time as a Presbyterian and independent teacher, which showed that at that point the dissenters were pretty much a united group. But the limited toleration did not last very long. In fact, it lasted only a year until the Test Act of 1673, and toleration was not restored until 1689. And so the congregation had to continue under the threat of persecution. And a number of ministers suffered imprisonment at this time, one of whom was the Reverend John Fairfax. Owen Stockton died in September 1680, and he was succeeded by John Fairfax, another one of the ejected clergy. He had been the rector of Barking in Suffolk. After becoming minister to the Ipswich dissenters, both Presbyterians and independents, Fairfax also continued to preach to the congregation in Needham Market. In 1686, the independents and the Presbyterians parted company. The independents went on to form the Congregational Church, now Christ Church, in Tackett Street. In 1687, the Ipswich Presbyterians, under Fairfax, transferred their meetings to a house in Silent Street. In 1689, the so-called Toleration Act was passed, which permitted freedom of worship to dissenters and allowed them to build their own meeting houses. It took 10 years for the Ipswich Presbyterians to achieve this goal, with the contract to build being signed on the 5th of August 1699, and the opening service of the meeting house was held on the 26th of April 1700. John Fairfax preached on that occasion a sermon entitled Primitiae Synagogae, which can be translated as First Meeting Houses, and it's a defence of the congregation's decision to build their own meeting house. Why the need for this? Because the English Presbyterians were, in a sense, reluctant dissenters and had harboured the hope of returning to a Church of England reformed on Presbyterian lines. But by 1699, they had pretty much accepted that this would never happen. Fairfax died on the 11th of August 1700, aged 77, to be succeeded by the Reverend Samuel Baxter. Fairfax and his congregation were not Unitarians, but something of the liberal religious spirit found expression in the sermon delivered at his funeral by his friend and colleague, the Reverend Samuel Berry of Bury St Edmunds. Berry said this: "Let us never impale religion within ourselves, or presently call fire from heaven on them that will not receive us. Let religion in its own latitude be the common bond of all union, and whatever differences may be amongst us in smaller matters, yet let us be lovers of all good men." In his sermon on the 26th of April 1700, John Fairfax declared that I cannot censure as some do, but must commend this congregation that they have at so great charge erected this large, spacious meeting house. He was making it clear that the building was the result of a community effort. But what do we know about the community and its members? Clearly they would have been a substantially different group from those who formed the first group of Ipswich dissenters 38 years earlier. Passage of time and the withdrawal of the independents would have seen to that. I have seen a reference to the Presbyterian congregation having numbered 300 during Fairfax's ministry, but this may only refer to the mainly male heads of household, and would exclude not only children and young people, but possibly many or most women as well. Poorer attenders who couldn't afford to be subscribers also may not have been included in the figures. So we don't really know how big the community was, but the meeting house itself was said in 1830 to have a capacity of 1,200 persons, although as to whether the congregation was ever that size, I really don't know. It's worth saying that places of worship are usually built on the optimistic side, with plenty of room to spare. At that time, the population in Ipswich was apparently around 7,500. We can put names to some of the families who worshipped in the meeting house at that time, and prominent among them is the name of Bantoft. Thomas Bantoft was a key figure in that it was he who, according to his will of 1705, had bought land in St Nicholas parish from Thomas Bloss for £150, since which purchase a meeting house or place for the service of Almighty God hath been erected. We may assume, I think, that Thomas Bantoft was a major contributor to the building of the meeting house. Also, he included £50 towards the cost of the galleries, along with a further £45, 10 shillings. And he wasn't the only one who gave money. In a codicil, he mentions my cousin John Groom and John May, who were to be paid what they lent upon the building the said chapel. Thomas Bantoft was a mercer, a dealer in expensive and high-quality textiles, such as silk, and clearly a successful one. He owned property in Ipswich and land and estates in nearby villages, and had shares in a ship called the Philip, the town being an important port, which also had shipyards. Thomas had good dissenting credentials. His uncle, the Reverend Samuel Bantoft, had been one of the ejected clergy of 1662. Prior to Black Bartholomew and his expulsion by what was called an unrighteous power, Samuel had been vicar of Stebbing in Essex and a tutor at Cambridge. Of Thomas Bantoft's immediate family, we learn something from his will. No wife is mentioned, so we may assume that she was dead by this time, but he names 3 daughters, Elizabeth, Sarah and Mary, and 2 sons, Samuel and Thomas. And here we come across what must have been a great sadness to the family. The will lays on Bantoft's sister Elizabeth and cousin Mary the responsibility to pay for the care of my son Thomas Bantoft, who suffered from a distemper of mind which renders him incapable to take care of himself. He was, it seems, mentally ill, and is said elsewhere to have died insane. Elizabeth Bantoft, charged with her nephew's care, also played an important role in the story of the congregation. She was clearly a woman of substance and an influential figure at a time when women were mostly kept in the background. When, on the 5th of August 1699, 6 members of the congregation signed the contract for the building of the meeting house, Thomas Bantoft was one of them. The professions, trades, or positions of the other 5 give an idea of what sort of people led the congregation at this time. 2, Edward Gale and Robert Snelling, are each described as gentlemen, indicating both wealth and elevated social status. 2 others are John Groom, described as a linen weaver, and John May, a clothier. The 6th is Thomas Catchpole, described as a beer brewer. The contract includes a provision for 4 barrels of good small beer to be supplied to Joseph Clark and his men whilst employed in the said building. Beer which it seems likely that Catchpole supplied. We learn from Catchpole's will that his wife was called Priscilla, and that he owned the Rose and the George in Ipswich, and the Swan in Stratford, presumably Stratford St Mary. Catchpole's brewery survived until 1923, when it became part of Tullycobbold. The wills also provide evidence of charitable concern and of the presence in the congregation of less prosperous people. Edward Gale's will states, "And unto the poor of the congregation and society whereof I am a member, and Mr. Samuel Baxter is pastor, the sum of £5 to be distributed among them." Robert Snelling's will leaves £3 amongst 4 poor persons belonging to the society or congregation whereof I am a member. One of the first trustees, William Sparrow, left 40 shillings to the poor of Mr. Samuel Baxter's congregation in Ipswich. Another trustee, John Jennings, made a more comprehensive bequest and left to 10 poor boys that are the sons of poor religious parents belonging to Mr. Baxter's congregation the sum of £60, to each boy £6, to bind them out apprentices to some honest trade or calling. And Jennings also left to 20 aged poor people belonging to Mr. Baxter's congregation the sum of £10, to each person 10 shillings. Trustee Samuel Parish, during the ministry of one of Baxter's successors, made an interesting proviso in his will of 1743. He left £100 for the support of the meeting house in Ipswich, whereof the said Reverend Mr. Scott is pastor, unless it shall happen by any succeeding troublesome times that the said meeting house be appropriated to other purposes than the present manner of worshipping Almighty God there, and the society be broke and dispersed. Parish was apparently one of those who were not confident that the congregation's freedom of worship was secure. And Parish also took thought for the education of the poor, leaving to the Dissenters' Charity School in Ipswich, where Elisha Elinet is master, the sum of £40. Elizabeth Bantos' will of 1728, besides a list of beneficiaries peppered with names from the congregation and 2 of its ministers, Samuel Baxter and Samuel Say, leaves £10 to the poor of the congregation and 40 shillings to the industrious poor of St Clement's and St Stephen's parishes. And provision is also made for her unfortunate nephew, the younger Thomas Bantoft. A rather unusual bequest in the will of one J. Leggett, who left to the trustees of the Society of Protestant Dissenters in the parish of St Nicholas a tenement for the use and habitation of the person or persons employed as doorkeeper of the said meeting. The trustee William Alts made a more personal request in his will. "I desire my very good friend Mr. Samuel Baxter of Ipswich to preach my funeral sermon, for which I give him 2 gold guineas." The first trustees were appointed on the 14th of February 1711, quite some time after the opening of the meeting house, perhaps because of a long-running legal dispute with the builder or house carpenter Joseph Clark. So trouble with builders is not a new phenomenon. Thomas Bantoft had died by this time, and it was his sister Elizabeth, along with Fairfax's friend and colleague Samuel Berry, two of his executors, who transferred ownership of the land and building to the trustees. And there were 20 trustees, plus the minister, Samuel Baxter, at that time. Of these four, Edward Gale, Robert Snelling, John May, and Thomas Catchpole had been signatories to the contract of 1699. The others had an interesting range of occupations. Samuel Parish was a linen draper. William Alps and Thomas Woods were yeomen, farmers, owning their own land. Henry Eads and Thomas Wilder were maltsters. John Holborough was a woolen draper. John Jennings was a hosier. Samuel Burrows was a tallow chandler. John Bumstead was a woolcomber. Thomas Bacon was a schoolmaster. James Smith was an ironmonger, and Thomas Harper made chairs. There were also two more gents, Richard Girling and William Sparrow. And such was the variety of people who, along with their wives and families, formed the congregation at the beginning of the 18th century. The wills show how closely intertwined and interrelated these leading families often were, and sometimes contain some rather charming personal details. For example, William Alp's will contains the following: I give and bequeath unto the said Elizabeth my wife my feather bed, as it stands in the parlour of my dwelling house, which we usually lie upon together. The contract to build the meeting house, signed on the 5th of August 1699 by 6 members of the congregation on the one hand and by the house carpenter Joseph Clark on the other, agreed the construction in good, orderly and workmanlike manner of a good, new, strong and substantial house for a meeting place. It was to be in length 60 foot and in breadth 50 foot, and it was to have a double roof to be borne up in the middle with 4 good and substantial columns. It was to be in height 120 foot from the floor to the ceiling. And this, of course, is what we still have today. According to tradition, the substantial columns are ship's masts, but unfortunately, there is no way of verifying this charming tale. The contract further stipulates that all the ground sills and ground gyves for the floor of the building shall be of good oaken timber, and all the rest to be built of good fir red wood. The walls were to be laid without side with good fir red wood. There were to be 2 pair of good substantial doors, which is rather odd since there are actually 3. And there were to be also as many necessary girt windows 4 foot wide and 6 feet deep, to be all made of red wood fir. Inexplicably, this doesn't include the 3 oval lunettes high above the doors, which are original and which resemble those found in Christopher Wren's London churches. And according to the architect Keith Pert, the circular lunettes in the south wall may not be original in their present form, and he thinks that they were probably installed after 1900, although of course I think there must always have been windows in that position. The accounts, which also survive, show that the cost of the basic construction was £256, 14 shillings and 6 pence, although the final total was substantially more. The building has some further features that were not included in the contract. The galleries, for example, occupying 3 sides of the interior, cost a further £96 to be paid in instalments, and glazing too was extra, and neither pews nor pulpit are mentioned in the contract. It's not surprising that the building took longer to erect than the 2 months allowed in the contract, a delay that led to years of legal wrangling. and it must have been something of a rush to have the place ready for the opening service. The pulpit is the central feature of the interior and is particularly fine. The wood carving is characteristic of the late 17th century and is in the style of Grinling Gibbons, to whom it was once attributed, but it is now thought to be unlikely. However, it is probably the work of someone who learned his skills with Gibbons and may well have come from his workshop. It would have been an expensive item, an extra to the cost of the building. Other original fittings not mentioned in the contract are the hexagonal clock, believed to be older than the building, and the Dutch brass chandelier. Although there have been some changes to the building over the centuries, not least at the time of the major, though sympathetic restoration in 1900, they remain substantially as it was when first opened. Daniel Defoe, himself a dissenter, visited the meeting house in the early 1720s. He wrote of it in his tour through England and Wales that it is as large and as fine a building of that kind as most on this side of England, and the inside the best finished of any I have seen, London not excepted. The interior arrangement is characteristic of the meeting houses built by congregations in the Reformed Protestant tradition. The central elevated pulpit emphasized that the reading and preaching of the Word of God was the most important aspect of worship. It is the preaching of the Word that is elevated rather than the preacher, whose religious status was the same as that of anyone else in the congregation. The large central space in front of the pulpit is for a communion table, though not the present one, and the celebration of the Lord's Supper. The congregation still has 4 17th and 18th century silver porringers that were used for communion, and formerly had 2 silver patens too. The porringers are 2-handled silver cups, originally for use in private homes, but donated to the meeting house. And this tells us more about the congregation at that time. One is inscribed, "The gift of Mary Beaumont, January the 13th, 1786. She was the granddaughter of Thomas Bantoft and the daughter of Sarah Bantoft, who had married an apothecary named John Beaumont." Like other members of the congregation, Sarah and John also made a bequest, £10 in their case, to the poor of what was then called the Presbyterian Meeting House. One of the other cups, the finest, bears the coat of arms of the Snelling family, who also gave the patens. They were prominent members of the meeting house congregation. The letters AL inscribed on the base may indicate that the actual donor was Alice Lawrence, the daughter of trustee Robert Snelling. Her husband, Robert Lawrence, was involved in responding to the needs of Huguenot refugees after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685. The position of the communion table in the midst of the congregation is in stark contrast to the position of the altar in the traditional church arrangement. It emphasized that the dissenters' Lord's Supper is most certainly not the Roman Catholic Mass or the Anglican Eucharist. It is a simple meal in memory of Jesus at the Last Supper, shared by a congregation of spiritual equals, although the minister would usually preside. This positioning of the communion table, like that of the pulpit, was one of the ways in which the meeting house was designed to express the beliefs and theology of a congregation of Protestant dissenters. Another is the absence of stained glass picture windows, as they were called by their critics, or any other representation of human or supernatural beings, or even of animals, all of which would have been regarded as idolatrous. The carving on the pulpit portrays vegetable matter only. The windows are of plain glass designed to offer no distraction to the worshipper. and to allow the unmediated inflow of clear light. This represents the unmediated and direct relationship between God and the believer. The simplicity of this Puritan space, which doesn't even contain a cross, was intended to both demonstrate and symbolize the purification of Christianity from what was seen as the corrupting accretions added by Roman Catholicism and retained by Anglicanism. The doves and cherubs over the external door frames are, importantly, outside the worship space. The winged cherub over the clock, with his piece of music, is not original and dates from 1799, when the first organ was installed in the gallery. Attitudes had mellowed by this time. When the meeting house was opened, there would have been no music other than the unaccompanied singing of psalms led from the reading desk by a precentor. Although the arrangement of the seating on all sides of the building emphasizes the nature of the congregation as a gathered community of spiritual equals, the box pews did not in themselves have any particular theological significance. They did, though, mean that a family could have its own pew, complete with a lock, as can still be seen on the doors of some of them. Pew rent was a way of subscribing to the community as well as guaranteeing a seat. The central block of downstairs pews, although original, were rearranged in the 1900 restoration so that all the seats faced the front. Originally, the seating was on four sides, as those against the east and west walls still do. And one of these has preserved a piece of the original brick flooring. Before 1900, the pews extended right to the back of the building, but were moved then to accommodate vestries, vestibules, and the organ. The wooden parquet floor dates from 1900. The double door in the east wall was the original main entrance, and the meeting house was approached through the alleyway, once gated, from St. Nicholas Street. This concealment from public view, as it then was quite deliberate. It might also help to explain the building's resemblance to a large private house. In the 17th century, dissenters were often persecuted and proscribed, so when they finally got to build their own meeting houses, they were conscious that continued toleration could not be guaranteed. This also explains the spy hole in the east door, which is a famous little item which people, but children in particular, delight to have a look through. And the spy hole was there to watch out for intruders. It was not an idle fear, because the hostile mob or officials sent by an oppressive government was a real threat, and meeting houses were sometimes attacked. The most notable example was the destruction of Joseph Priestley's new meeting, along with his house and laboratory, by a Church and King mob in Birmingham in 1791. Although there is no record of the Ipswich congregation being disturbed in this way, they still thought it was necessary to have the spy hole. The trust deed. Provision for the ownership of the meeting house, or chapel as it's described in that document, and the associated messages and tenements was to pass to a board of 12 faithful trustees out of the most considerable subscribers to the building. And this provision was made in a codicil to Thomas Bantoff's will dated 10th of August 1705. In the meantime, ownership was vested in his four executors. They were his sister, Elizabeth Bantoft, his cousin, Mary Bantoft, Samuel Berry, minister at Bury St Edmunds, and Nathaniel Burnand, a gentleman of Harwich. In the event, it was another 7 years before the transfer took place, by which time only Elizabeth Bantoft and Samuel Berry were still alive. And it was these two who are named on the one part in the indenture or trust deed dated the 14th of February 1711. 21 men are named as being of the other part. And since the document stipulates that the number of trustees shall not consist of more than 20, we might ask why 21 are named. Perhaps as minister, Samuel Baxter had some sort of ex officio status. The deed also states that the number of trustees was not to fall below 9, and that when vacancies occurred, then the remaining trustees were to appoint 4 or more other, the most prudent and substantive persons of sober life and conversation and good and honest repute. Their responsibility was the better ordering, maintaining, managing or disposing of the said meeting house and the pews and seats there. And they're also responsible for all sums of money, rents and profits and trusts, etc. Interestingly, the trustee doesn't actually stipulate that trustees must be men, talking rather about persons, although there is no record of women becoming trustees until 1976. These things take time. The trustee gives the purpose of the meeting house as being a meeting place for the worship of Almighty God, with no further doctrinal conditions and provisions. And this makes it a so-called open trust, in that apart from that single requirement, it allows for changes in theology, doctrine, and belief. It was this openness that allowed the congregation to change and develop its faith and practice as the years passed by. No doubt this liberalism was unintentional, the drafters of the trust deed not conceiving that beliefs might change radically or even change at all. Nevertheless, it was this openness that paved the way for the congregation to make the move to Unitarianism, which it had done by the end of the 18th century, if not before. The trust deed also says that it's for the people of the Presbyterian congregation of persuasion. But Presbyterian is not actually a doctrinal term, and in fact the full Presbyterian system had never been established in England, so that provision in the trust deed simply ceased to be relevant. The Unitarian denomination as such didn't really come into existence until the 19th century, after the passing of the so-called Trinity Act in 1813. Were there any indications of a Unitarian presence in Ipswich before this? Perhaps there were. An interesting figure in the 17th century was the wealthy Ipswich-born London businessman and philanthropist Thomas Firmin. Although an Anglican, he belonged to the supporters of the Unitarian pioneer John Biddle, who had suffered imprisonment for his beliefs during the Commonwealth. Firmin was a member of a group trying to promote Unitarian ideas within the Church of England through publishing the so-called Unitarian tracts. He also supported the Huguenot refugees who fled France, a concern he seems to have shared with one of the trustees, John Groom. Firmin helped Huguenots to set up a silk manufacture in Ipswich, which may have led to contact with Thomas Bantoft, who as a mercer would have dealt with this material. Apparently Firmin's generosity is said to have extended to help to the then Presbyterian congregation under John Fairfax when they were meeting in Silent Street. Also worth mentioning Joseph Priestley at this point. He's better known today, of course, as a scientist, but his chosen profession was actually the dissenting ministry, and he was to become the foremost Unitarian theologian of his day. His first ministry, which was rather an unhappy one, was in fact at Needham Market from 1755 to 1758. And during this time, his increasingly unorthodox views made him unpopular both with his congregation and with other ministers in the area. But one or two ministers still made him welcome, and one was the minister at the Ipswich Meeting House from 1737 to 1766, the biblical scholar Thomas Scott, who Priestley called the most learned of my acquaintances, who was well versed in the Oriental languages, especially in Arabic. This would seem to indicate that Priestley's dawning Unitarianism, he had already moved from Arminianism to Arianism, found a tolerant, even sympathetic hearing at the Meeting House. It has been said of Scott that the fame of his best-selling verse translation of the Book of Job matched the skill with which he and his successors managed their members' gradual transition to unorthodoxy. It is certainly possible that Priestley was invited to preach in the Meeting House, as pulpit exchanges were quite common at the time. Although Priestley had a serious problem with his speech, he suffered from a speech impediment, a severe stutter, and this apparently limited the number of invitations which he received to preach while he was in Suffolk. And finally, just a word about the Fairfax sermon. Primitiae Synagogae, sermon preached at the opening of Ipswich's new erected meeting house on the 26th of April 1700, and it was published with a dedication to Sir Thomas Cudden, Chamberlain of the City of London, who belonged to an old Suffolk family. The text was Exodus 20:24, "In all places where I record my name, I will come unto thee, and I will bless thee." And the sermon sets out to establish that the meeting house is such a place. Fairfax traces the history of places set aside for holy, true worship, from an altar of earth to the tabernacle which Moses reared up in the wilderness. And of the need to provide such places, Fairfax says, "For reason and the light of nature doth certainly dictate this." The place of reason in faith was to become increasingly important for the congregation, just as the light of nature was such an important feature of the building itself. Fairfax, translating the Old Testament Hebrew, calls Moses' great tent in the wilderness the tabernacle of the congregation, and then adds that this may as properly be rendered the tabernacle of meeting. Later he returns to this term in a statement that has been as relevant for later congregations as it was for Fairfax's. We are now in the tabernacle of meeting, where we meet not only one with another, but all with God. And this is why it is a meeting house. In another memorable phrase, Fairfax explains why the worship of an omnipresent God needs particular places to be set aside for it. Although God's essential presence is everywhere, says Fairfax, when he is said to be present with men in one place more than another, this denotes a specialty of presence. This specialty of presence perhaps is what worshippers in the meeting house have felt since that day in 1700, something brought to it by the faith and worship of its continuing and continuous community. Fairfax may have been a dissenter, but as a Presbyterian hoping for a reformed Church of England, he was a reluctant one and retained a reverence and respect for those, what he called those stately, magnificent and sumptuous structures are public churches. Indeed, he lamented, had we the liberty of those places, we should seek no other. The dissenters' exclusion from the churches was not their choice, he said, but these doors being shut against us, it is our necessity to worship God as conveniently as we can in meaner places with a good conscience. But meaner places or not, Fairfax still congratulated his congregation for building this large, spacious meeting place. and for having adorned it both without and within. It is but reasonable, he continued, that a house of God and his solemn service should equal, if not exceed, our own habitation. But what happened in the meeting house was serious business, and Fairfax made it clear that this was no place for unseemly levity. Did we apprehend this? Could we talk or laugh, or indulge ourselves to sleep, or give liberty to wandering eyes, thoughts, or affection? When it came to worship, proper respect must be shown. Could we think, asked Fairfax, that covering the head under the word read or preached, or sitting on our seats at prayer or at blessing, were a becoming posture? To what extent these strictures applied equally to men and women, I'm not sure, but I would have thought that women were expected to cover their hair in accordance with 1 Corinthians 11 verse 5. But every woman that prayeth or prophesieth with her head uncovered dishonoureth her head. Head also meaning, besides her actual head, meaning her husband, along with Christ and God. It is possible that men and women actually sat separately at this time, as was the case in other Reformed Protestant churches. Not to mention synagogues, of course, where Fairfax said the members of the Jewish church were bound to keep the Sabbath every week. Physical resemblances between synagogues and meeting houses were not coincidental, as Fairfax's title for his sermon suggests. The reputed wig pegs that can still be found in a few of the meeting house pews are a reminder that some men at least were wearing wigs in accordance with current fashion in the 17th century. The wig pegs may have been for men's hats too, of course, as worship required them to be bareheaded for much, if not all, of the time. There were exceptions to these rules, unless the body require it, said Fairfax, and then God will have mercy and not sacrifice. Towards the close of the sermon, Fairfax draws some spiritual lessons from the building of the meeting house. Let us not satisfy ourselves that we have built this house of God for his solemn worship. This is not our whole duty. Nay, it is but a small part thereof. God expects that we prepare him another habitation, even our hearts. The purpose of the material house is the building of the spiritual house in ourselves, which habitation Christ will sanctify and beautify if he enters into us and dwelleth in us. Fairfax closes with the injunction to be ready for God's call and to beware of ignoring it. Attend seriously and conscientiously on such means as through which God doth ordinarily communicate his Spirit, and that is chiefly the ministry of the Word. He continues, take heed of shutting the door of thy heart against the Spirit, and hear what God says. Thus shall we open the door, Fairfax declares, and warns, but if we stop our ear, harden our heart, quench the Spirit, stifle its motions, what is this but to turn the Holy Ghost out of doors and say to the Almighty, depart from us? Rather, we should treat the Spirit of God kindly, so that he will be with us, within us, and we shall be his habitation. Fairfax's final words are an assurance of something greater than any physical house. When this synagogue which ye have built shall be demolished, and the earthly house of the tabernacle of our bodies be dissolved, we shall have a building of God, and house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. The Fairfax sermon gives us an insight into the faith and worship of the meeting house congregation in April 1700. And although it shows little evidence of Unitarianism, the congregation was to become Unitarian within a century. I won't go through all that now, but there is one story relating to a copy of the Fairfax sermon that points the way, and it relates to a man called John Notcutt, a name not unknown in this area. The son of William Notcutt, the noted independent or Congregationalist minister at Ipswich's other dissenting meeting house, which had been opened in Tackett Street in 1720, John followed his father into the ministry. He became pastor at the Green Street Meeting House in Cambridge sometime before 1740. In 1741, he entertained the foremost Protestant dissenter of the day, Philip Doddridge. But despite this connection, Notcutt left Green Street soon afterwards under something of a cloud. When his successor was appointed, it was said that he came to a thorny field, and hope was expressed that the successor would revive vital religion in the congregation, and as Doddridge put it, retrieve their honour. So what had gone wrong with John Notcutt's ministry at Green Street? What had gone wrong was that John Notcutt was a Socinian, that is to say, a Unitarian. John left the ministry and returned to Ipswich. And a few years ago, a copy of the Fairfax sermon came to light with John Notcutt's signature inside. It was presumably his personal copy. This seems to indicate that on his return to Ipswich in the 1740s, John joined the Meeting House congregation and not his father's. The minister at the time was Thomas Scott. As members of the Notcutt family were to be important figures at the Unitarian Meeting House for the next 260 years or so, we may assume that John Notcutt, the Socinian, found a welcome in the congregation there. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Dr. Elizabeth Kingston Harrison. She works for the General Assembly of the Unitarian and Free Christian Churches, fostering connections between congregations and strengthening the fabric of the movement during an exciting and challenging time for change in the nation. Her doctorate, which she received from the University of Sussex, elucidates the work of Unitarian minister and thinker Joseph Priestley and his wider intellectual, cultural, and political context. I have to say I'm particularly interested in hearing more about this because for me, Joseph Priestley is a chemist. Yes, and now you're going to tell me that he's also a theologian, which is very exciting. In particular, Lizzie is interested in the ways in which Priestley's understanding of scriptural metaphor underpinned his Unitarian theology, and in the extraordinarily original, coherent, and unifying worldview which Priestley developed to support and explain this position. She lived in Ipswich for many years, teaching history at Northgate High School, and now lives with a family in Framlingham. And this year, she will be following in Priestley's footsteps as she begins training as a Unitarian minister. The title of her talk is A Comet in the System, Joseph Priestley and the Emergence of Rational Dissent in the 18th Century.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me? Don't applaud yet, I haven't said anything. So here I am, talking with my hair uncovered, obviously, so some things have changed. Yeah, I'm okay? Good. Okay. I've already been in my elements today because I went to look at the documents that are on display, and thank you for everything that's been done to make that happen. I just love being immersed in that kind of that richness and that depth and that detail. And the same with Cliff's talk as well, the detail of the people kind of brought to life. So yeah, thank you for that. And now it's time to kind of take a step back or zoom out or take a deep breath. You might need one. to contemplate the big picture, the breadth of the era that links us back to those early dissenters. They were brave and they were real and they worked for what they believed in. And when I was holding the things that people had written and published, it's like I could just reach out and touch them. There's this arc, isn't it? This big stretch, this big wave of time, and when you take a step back, you can see the patterns and the nuances and the colours, which you can't always see when you're right there in the depths. And after 25 years of studying and teaching history, I still find that a breathtaking perspective. So, yeah, as Mike said in his introduction, I'm Lizzie. I'm a Unitarian, and I'm a historian of ideas. And specifically, I'm interested in the history of epistemology, of the competing theories of knowledge and truth, of facts and the mind in the 18th century, and the related debates about language and the mind at that time. And more broadly, I'm interested in the relationship between ideas and the contexts, the people, the feelings, the thoughts, the culture in which they emerge. And recently I've come alive contemplating systems that create space for new ideas to emerge, and the ways in which those ideas help shape change that touches us all in our real lives. So I'm a big picture person. If you were hoping for some historical detail, there's nothing to see here. You could go. So yeah, thank you. I'm grateful to be here. The next half an hour or so, we're going to explore some of the intellectual patterns that led to the emergence of a group of unique and confident and vocal and brave and optimistic thinkers with a liberating theology, which historians now tend to call rational dissent. And across the 18th century, we can see rational dissent emerging really from the shadows. I like that they started in Ipswich in Silent Street. We find rational dissent kind of swelling in strength and number, and begin to say in a confident public voice, despite it still being illegal to be Unitarian, that which had previously been whispered. Study the world, they said, be good natural philosophers. Study human nature, study the Bible, and do this by applying your God-given reason, not your prejudice, your passions, or the authority of others. And what does your reason tell you? What if we're not born sinful? They whispered that to each other, and then they said it out loud to their congregations. And if Adam didn't fall, and if he didn't incur an infinite penalty, do we really need a special sacrifice? Is there a wrath of God to divert? What if we're all just okay? They said. Maybe Jesus wasn't needed as a substitute for sin. Maybe he was a saviour because he just lived a really good moral life, a demonstration of perfect moral duty and resurrection. Priestley believed in resurrection. This means that God's grace is freely given, they said. All people have the potential for perfection. There's no sheep and goats, so chill out. Stop worrying about it. No one's chosen or predestined to eternal torment. What if universal salvation is possible for everybody? That's rational dissent, crystallised into its kind of purest form. And actually, at that level, at that zoomed out level, it's really a set of propositions about everything, from the nature of matter, the stuff that we're made of, and the human mind, and the external universe, about the nature of God, and about the man, Jesus. And all of that is for you, not for them, with their authority and their Latin, but it's for you. It's a truth for everybody, accessible using your human reason. That's what they said. And this isn't really a theological point. It is, but it's more than that. For people like Priestley, this kind of all-encompassing project is a way of explaining everything. And so it has tangible political consequences. It comes along with a commitment to social action and to the rights of women and men, and slaves and children and animals, and radical challenges to the establishment. And for the Unitarians in the room, this is our inheritance. These are our good ancestors. And some of them did that work in Ipswich, in the Meeting House. It was built for that sacred work. I said I was interested in change. And counterintuitively, change emerges when dominant systems are reaching their heights. At the peak of their power, they're climbing up the big wave in the picture. And this is the beginning of the era that I'm interested in. Rational dissent stirred first in the individual conscience, long before it became a coherent public theology. That, as Cliff has already told us, there was a set of measures in the 1660s to repress dissent from the kind of the confessional state, it becomes known as in the 18th century, this kind of entwined power of Anglicanism and the government. Cliff actually took us through some of those measures, so I won't go back over them, but remember that the Corporation Act restricted membership of all sorts of powerful institutions to people who would stand up and take the Anglican Communion. The Conventicle Act limited the number of people who could gather, and every now and again Unitarian congregations still seem to be acting under the Conventicle Act. I think it's like 10 or something, I don't know. Of course, the Act of Uniformity limited the number of dissenters who could gather, required clergymen to assent to the Book of Common Prayer, and the 5 Mile Act then prevented those dissenters from going back to their pulpits and to certain corporations. But during that time, the courage and the conscience of those what became known as old dissenters, it stayed fast. They were going nowhere. And actually, perhaps as a sign of growing power and confidence, or perhaps in recognition of that, the Toleration Act then recognised their existence and suspended some penalties. Although the legal penalties for Unitarianism, as Cliff reminded us, stayed in place until 1813. And so after the Toleration Act, old dissent begins to emerge. These mixed congregations of dissenters coalesce around various interesting theologies and approaches to governance, and the dissenting colleges were established. I just registered at a dissenting college, and actually Priestley was the first member of that dissenting college, and it's and it still exists in a form today. And in the latter part of the century, ministers and lay people and whole congregations were openly Unitarian. And this is where Joseph Priestley comes in. Joseph Priestley was born into a middle-class family in Yorkshire in 1733, and he died in Pennsylvania in 1804. And yes, he's often remembered as a scientist, a natural philosopher, celebrated for his isolation of the gas that we call oxygen, which he always refused to call oxygen. But he was actually a proper polymath. He had a really expansive range of interests, and he explored them alongside his calling as a Unitarian minister. And he grew up in this world of old dissents. He was brought up by a Calvinist aunt, and a little bit later I'll explain how that felt for him. He was encouraged to some extent to develop a personal relationship with God and to study scripture and to take theology seriously and debate ideas with that kind of serious Protestant earnestness and the kind of middle-class respectability that so characterised that era. And his personal story mirrors the arc of change from personal doubts and private stirring to learning and connecting with mentors, questioning the organising doctrine of the atonement and the Trinity, becoming a student and then a tutor at the dissenting colleges, and then loudly espousing a coherent and vibrant and confident Unitarianism by the 1770s. And Priestley was one of those expansive, big picture people too. He had this extraordinary kind of unifying understanding of the mind and matter and God. And it was that provided the strength of the intellectual foundation that allowed rational dissent to emerge in the way that it did. And this included the opening of the first avowedly Unitarian chapel in Essex Street, which was exactly 300 years ago. 250. Can you feel it? Can you feel that big arc of change? Can you feel it in society? Can you feel it in you? Those stirrings that you get, a kind of coalescing around ideas, and then sharing and connecting with others, and then reaching outward, and that kind of confident sweep upward as you think, I think I'm onto something here. And you give voice to that which was hidden. So for the rest of the time that we have together, we're going to explore Priestley and change and his vision, and look at Priestley as an agent of change across the era. I've put this bit as an aside, but I don't think it is an aside. I think this might be the essence of what I'm trying to say. I was reading Fairfax's sermon and I was listening to Cliff talk about Fairfax. Here it is. That's the picture I chose for it, because the other day I saw a rainbow around the sun in Yorkshire. What I noted when I was reading Fairfax's sermon is that the energy in that sermon, the movement in that sermon is all about the particular to the universal. So he's establishing this kind of unique meeting house, this particular place, this one moment in time, this specific congregation. And actually, it's the same quote, Cliff, that you use that I've written down, the specialty of presence of God, while acknowledging also that God is everywhere, particular and universal. And he invites his congregation to celebrate the building itself, while also cultivating the temple in their hearts for a universal spirit. And as a historian of ideas, or an intellectual historian, technically, I'm always on the lookout for when the same ideas appear in earlier forms and in different words at different times. And Fairfax is writing before Priestley was born. But I'm intrigued to notice that same movement from the part to the whole, because that is what defined Priestley's work, and it's that that gave people the confidence to speak out 100 years later. The whole constellation of Priestley's thought may be seen as arranged around that significance of moving from the particular to the universal. It's that gave him momentum, and it's that energy that gave him a mission. This part of the talk, which is unrelated to William Blake in every way, but it also involves a slide with a quote from Blake on it, is actually called Links in a Great Connected Chain, which is Priestley's metaphor, which I didn't write down anywhere. Can you see the world in a grain of sand and heaven in a wildflower? Like Fairfax, right? Moving from the particular to the universal. Priestley was a great scientist and a rationalist. I'm not sure if I would have got on that well with him. I think he liked facts and things that you can empirically verify. And for him, our external world was one of endless analogies and reciprocations. He saw patterns and order and harmony in nature. He saw a universe that was defined and connected and unified by its endless resemblance to itself. Know the part, he said, and you'll one day know the whole. And we're fragments, but we're also everything, aren't we? And we're parts of something breathtakingly large. Priestley said it doesn't really matter where you start, which was handy because he had a really terrible memory and he'd often repeat the same experiments over and over again. So it's probably for the best that he didn't think it mattered where you started or ended. What matters is you begin with something, you just get on with it, you crack on with looking at something, and you use that detail to generate a picture of the whole. And he called this analytic reasoning, and he has like a whole working definition of analytic reasoning which is unique, which I won't go into detail with, but you can email me about if you're really desperate to know about it. Reasoning by analogy, he called it. And he actually had one of those minds that's almost kind of made to perceive patterns and regularity in the kind of perceived chaos of the world. He said God's given us reason. He's created us and then put us into an ordered and predictable and accessible universe. And we can get it, we can grasp it. There's nothing magic about this, it's not supernatural. Here we are, let's look at the world. And that process of reasoning works because truth isn't subjective. It exists out there. And he was very, very keen to make sure that everyone understood that. Truths, scientific, theological, can be uncovered by the human mind because we're anchored in a divinely necessitated and pre-ordered world. And we have it in our power, in our gift to understand it. It's a democratizing approach. Can you feel that? It's for everybody. We all have that capacity, he said. Sometimes I meet people and I wonder. So how does it work? How are we made to perceive these apparent external truths? Well, Priestley had an almost unique understanding of the human mind. I'm going to outline it very briefly for you. And if you're wondering how that relates to the emergence of rational dissent, I'm going to have a really good stab at trying to link it back. But you might just want to enjoy this on its own terms. There's something very expansive about this. And so if you're less interested in the story of change and more interested in things that feel light and transcendent and open, you can just enjoy this bit if you want. Priestley drew heavily on the work of David Hartley. David Hartley said, all things become comments on each other in endless reciprocation. And actually a lot of my research suggests really that it's Hartley we should be talking about It's his psychology that underpins pretty much everything that Priestley did. So it's worth us paying attention to. It also tends to leave people with a sense of the breathtaking, infinite view of the divine that Priestley believed in. So maybe you'll enjoy it too. Priestley and Hartley said that the human mind is like a blank slate, or maybe like a crisp white sheet of paper that's had nothing written on it. And as we go through life, written upon that kind of pristine white tabula rasa of our non-fallen minds, are layers and layers of experience. There's no original sin here. And incoming sensory experiences from the external world become simple ideas in the mind. And over time, they build up into clusters of ideas. Sensate experience, intellectual ideas, complex congeries of ideas. And so life is so beautifully simple at first, and so awesomely complicated at the end. And if that resonates, maybe Priestley was right. Life is a mental journey towards ever greater understanding. Hartley said that these complex clusters of ideas are generated in a kind of mechanical way. It's passive, you don't really have to even do anything. But that's not the same as saying the process is static. You don't just generate a random idea of like a table or a book or something and then file it away. Rather, those congeries of ideas that make up a concept that you've grasped, they will travel with you. They get ever more hyper complex and subtle and sophisticated. And ideas become like bags that you pack your life experience into. And as more and more ideas become part of that kind of associative cluster in your mind, they get kind of more personal and idiosyncratic. They're yours because they reflect your life. That's who you are. You're a joyful and unique collection of experiences and ideas, and they're the basis of you yourself. Yourself has emerged like a weather system in the sky. It's kind of swirling in something endless. This isn't Priestley, this is me trying to explain it. Was there a time when your understanding of mum, was a sensate experience, a sense of needs met, if you're lucky, a sense of all that in which you live and move and have your being, a sense of being nurtured and fed and held and loved? You learnt the word mum to represent that sensate experience. And then, one day, you realise that your mum is just a mum. And the people around you have one too. And then, you remembered or you found out that you can use the word mum metaphorically to mean anything, anyone that feeds and nurtures and loves. That's the mechanical and verbal and emotional move from the particular to the universal that Priestley and Hartley said was the basis of all our human reason. I don't know why I chose that picture. If you've got any ideas about why I did, come and see me. This part of the talk is called The Worm at the Roots of Human Bliss. I think I might have been doing a Blake thing, like the invisible worm that flies through the night, the rose thing. So Priestley imagines this kind of mechanical generation of the self as like, I guess like an upward flow. It's kind of a river ascending, almost like a spiral gaining strength and power as it integrates previous knowledge into newer and newer understandings of the world. That was for you, Matthew, that's why I reference. Identifying analogies, becoming more and more complex and more comprehensive. And this happens in stages. we have these kinds of, I guess, like brute passions when we start off, and then later we have a kind of moral regulation as we began to see our impact of our actions on others. We become more, apparently, it's very optimistic, more moral and more benevolent, more likely to obey God's rules. This idea of kind of stages of change is actually fairly commonplace in the 18th century. And I think if Priestley and Hartley's story of the generation of the self stopped there, it wouldn't be hugely original, it would still be interesting, but I'm not sure if I'd do a whole lecture on it. Lots of other people were saying the same thing. But what Hartley and Priestley did that was really astonishing is they suggested it doesn't stop there. You don't stop with your kind of complex, moral, benevolent self. In fact, this is for the meditators in the room, they called the model of the self the idolatry of the self. They said if you stop there with that idea of the human self, you're kind of worshipping a little me rather than a transcendent being. The self is the worm at the heart of human bliss. And Hartley said if you give up that self, which he said was just you in your infancy, even if you're 100 years old, it's you in your infancy if that's how far you've got, then you can find complete happiness. And so Hartley said, well, how do you transcend the self? Well, you realise that love for others and love for God doesn't need regulating by anything, by the self. It can be as big as you like. Theopathy can increase infinitely. He called it the unbounded pleasure of that kind of benevolent love. Your other desires dissolve. There's nothing left to regulate. So there's no need for a self. And Priestley added something to that that is literally mind expanding. A random picture of the sky for you to symbolise your expansive, what the Buddhists call the big sky mind. Perfection of intelligent beings, Priestley writes, consists in comprehension of mind. Past and future merge with the present. Good and evil perfectly coalesce because every part is present to us. Comprehension of mind is generated by the same principle that transforms those early sensate experiences into intellectual ideas. We don't live in the present, he said. We grow older, we comprehend an ever-increasing breadth of time. We comprehend ever-increasing understandings of the universal principles that govern the universe. And we come to realise that somewhere we are infinite beings in a world designed for our ultimate happiness and union with God. Priestley's pretty optimistic about this bit. Suffering dissolves. Ideas of pain and evil coalesce with their ultimate ends. A comprehensive view elevates us and gives us dignity and raises us into a view which reveals that pleasure and pain and virtue and vice and subjective attachments and personal associations are nothing more than means to a great end, the mechanical, limitless transcendence of the self. I don't mean to sound mystical because Priestley wasn't, and I just want to say, like, he wouldn't be happy right now. He was a rationalist and an empiricist, but it's there in his work, so we may as well enjoy it. I don't know if I want to show you that bit yet. No, not yet. You have some more sky for this bit. I've got 2 sections left, probably about 10 minutes. I might just want to take a breath and have a think about what I've said so far. It's going to give you 30 seconds. Because it's going to get a bit more theological. I can see you bracing yourself, Rajan.
Excuse me. Can we ask questions?
No, not yet. Sorry, that's really harsh. Sorry. Let me finish, and then I think we're going to do them at the end. So Priestley said that all truths are accessible to the human mind. And one way, he said, that we can access those truths is by applying our reason to Scripture. Religious truth is one of the essential ways that we can broaden our understanding of God's plan, he said, and it's revealed through careful, rational study. And actually, he was quite brave, because then he did it. He didn't just say it, he then applied his reason to Scripture, and then he was courageous enough to stand firm in his convictions, even when the conclusions he generated were illegal and a bit idiosyncratic, and very much at odds with the dominant theology of the time. One of the things that Priestley had been taught during his Calvinist childhood was that he was sinful and fallen, and that there was nothing that he could do as a human to atone for his sin. He was taught that it's the sacrifice of Jesus, as one person of the Trinity, that reconciles us to God. That was broadly the culture. Anglicans, dissenting friends, most of them would have been believing that. The Calvinist bit is that he was also taught that some people have been chosen before time, kind of saved by grace already. That grace was generated by the sacrifice of Jesus. And the way that you can tell that you're saved, this is what he was taught, is that you kind of feel it inside, like it's a new birth. He was taught that it's the sacrifice of Jesus as God that saves us, and that the grace generated by that is what justified him. There's a copy of Priestley's autobiography in that room from like 1809 or something. And in that autobiography, he tells us of the pain and the distress that that theology gave him. Because at the heart of Priestley's childhood was the belief that there was nothing he could do to be good enough, to make up for those sins. I could not satisfy myself, he writes, that I'd ever had a new birth produced by the Holy Spirit. So I felt distress of mind that it is not in my power to describe. I look back upon it in horror. I concluded that God had forsaken me, like the man in the iron cage, if you know that reference, in Pilgrim's Progress. It was rational religion, rationality, empiricism, science, natural philosophy that saved Priestley from this horror. And in particular, it was his rejection of the doctrine of atonement and the Trinity on Unitarian grounds that restored him with a sense of mission and theology. Priestley found his salvation in reason. He said that doctrine of atonement, that Jesus had to die on our behalf, leads people into a state of perpetual alarm. Applying reason to Scripture, he said, leads us to mercy and salvation, and the idea that grace is given to all. Divine love encompasses all our failings, he said, and we do have a good role model in the human being Jesus to help us along the way. He said that doctrine of atonement is a corruption. It's not found in early Christian teaching. It's not in the Bible. There's nothing in the Bible that suggests that we can be reconciled to God by the sacrifice of an infinite being. And he says that doctrine is so misleading because it's based on a handful of metaphors that refer to Jesus as a sacrifice or a curse, as a lamb. And so Priestley's rejection of that doctrine of atonement that had done him such harm and was doing such harm to the people around him was part of a wider rejection of the Trinity itself, and part of an emphasis on the humanity of Jesus as an ultimate moral example. And that for Priestley was true salvation. And Priestley is full of contrasts between purity and corruption, the light and dark, the error and the truth, His work is so polemic in that theology, it's extraordinary. And as a historian of ideas, I just take it on its own terms. I don't necessarily believe everything Priestley believed or what he was writing against. I'm not channeling Priestley, it's not what I believe. But there is something extraordinary to watch a man in his spiritual and intellectual development grapple with these theological ideas, because it helps us understand where we've got to and where we're going. And so on that basis, Priestley also rejected the doctrine of the Trinity, and actually by the 1770s, I think, probably, in Leeds, he was a Unitarian. But why is this important? Why do we still need to know about this? And why do these ideas of Priestley still resonate in modern dissent? Well, part of that reason is because of that extraordinary kind of synoptic unity in his thought, that sort of bizarre and unique and exceptionally well-connected web of ideas that he used to explain everything. It gave him a sense of voice, and he was a man who struggled to talk. Cliff said, he was a man who struggled with voice, and actually you can read his whole life as an attempt to find a voice. I'm going to conclude with that mission as a way of trying to explain the emergence of rational dissent in the 18th century. As I said, I'm always on the lookout for when ideas appear in new places. Look at the dates from this. It's much later. Have a read. Can you see it at the back? I'm not going to read it out because I know you can read.
At the front, we can't see the last two lines.
Oh, I'll read them because they're very sort of, I can read them quite epically for you. If we can fairly perceive, one or two features of the constant order and glory of nature, our materialistic culture, dullness, would be broken, surprise and joy would be awakened, we should feel that we live among the play of infinite thought. I don't have a massive comment on that. I just thought it was really interesting because it's so much later. You can do your own work on that. Priestley clearly saw it as his personal mission to uncover what he called the naked facts. The naked facts of the historical events in Scripture, and let that Unitarian voice speak through the Bible. This was critically important to him throughout his life. And this calling, I think, was based on his epistemology. But then I would, because that's the kind of history I study. And I'm really happy to have a debate about whether it's something else. But it was because, I think, of this unique epistemology and his kind of equally idiosyncratic theology that Priestley became a significant driver of change in the system. Priestley's work still buzzes with intellectual and emotional and spiritual energy, and it was John Adams who described him as a comet in the system. And that metaphor for Priestley, a comet in the system, it evokes that blazing originality, doesn't it? And that bravery and that disruption to orthodox and predictable thought. But also, remember that when the universe throws up a comet, that comet is also part of the system. Its trajectory is already accounted for in the overall kind of necessitated balance and regulation. Priestley was disruptive and challenging. He truly was a comet in the system. But his ideas also emerged as part of the system, as well as in opposition to it. And how did they drive change? Well, Priestley's work on human nature and the natural world and his theological project all led him to one conclusion, that it is our freedom, it's our openness, that it's our ability to apply our reason that will lead us all in the right direction. And the extent to which we can be called free is the extent to which we are able to use our own reason, our own minds. And that's why he wrote, and he really did, write and write and write, and talk and preach and write again and produce pamphlets and then do some more writing and letters and have public arguments. That's why he did that, because he knew that ultimately we're all here to try and access truth, and that reason is nourished by rational debate and the art of conversation. Priestley was telling us that we're free. That's why his project was political, because he urgently demanded freedom of speech and thought to help us share that project. It was about education, because he felt that everyone should have the tools needed to find that play of infinite thought. And it was theological, because the truths of revelation and the simple humanity of Jesus as moral example are parts of that expanding story of the self. It's a bit like the bit in a cell that is the powerhouse in a cell. I don't know what it's called, but scientists will. Is it a mitochondria? Yeah. It's like that bit in a cell is like the powerhouse, isn't it? It's where the energy comes from. And it's a kind of definitive and inherent part of the cell. And that need to make things public, to come out of the shadows and to speak the word in a broad sense, that's embedded within the inherent structure of rational dissent. And it's driving it, and it's given it a kind of cultural momentum at this time and in this era. It's like a property of the system that emerges from the system of rational dissent and becomes something greater than it. And that's why, because of that theological and intellectual confidence that came from the work of Priestley, that's why rational dissent had emerged as a coherent, a small but mighty force. And it's why our culture in lots and lots of ways looks like it does today. And it's also why Unitarians are here today, having expansive and powerful conversations about freedom, about liberalism, about identity and education, and power and rights. And so that is Priestley's legacy. That's his gift to us as a good ancestor. I'm going to stop there, but I did just quickly want to say thank you to Matthew for his thoughts around integral philosophy. Thank you to Liz for introducing me to systems change. But most of all, where is she? Suzanne, thank you for being a brilliant chair of trustees at Framlingham Meeting House last year, and for being an equally brilliant historian and friend.
We have now 15-20 minutes for questions.